right, good afternoon and welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I'm Kate Jackson-Meyer, the Assistant Program Director here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to St. Paul's in Harvard Square. At the Harvard Catholic Forum, Catholic thought and culture engage the academy, the professions, and the arts. In addition to our lectures, we also offer an increasing array of non-credit courses. Check out our website at harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our newsletters and register for future events. And please consider supporting our important mission by making a financial contribution. Tonight, we offer the first lecture in our Fall 2022 Religion and Science series, which aims to explore the ways theology and science can illuminate the pursuit of truth in the life of discipleship. This event is made possible through the support of the John Templeton Foundation and the grant Illuminate, promoting the Catholic intellectual tradition on campuses nationwide. In bringing these events to you, we are thankful for the collaboration of the Illuminate Network. Please note this event will be archived in the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you would like to see more, please share the link in the channel to others who might be interested. All of our past events can be accessed in our archive at harvardcatholicforum.org. And please, if you can, take about 90 seconds to fill out our quick post-event survey, accessible through the QR code on the handout you received upon entering. We depend on your feedback to evaluate and improve our programs. Soon, Professor Karen Oberg will introduce our main speaker, Father John Kartje. Father John will speak for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity for some questions from the audience. When the program ends, please join us for a reception, fellowship, and conversation here in DG. It is now my pleasure to get us started with a few words from Professor Oberg. Professor Karen Oberg is professor in the Department of Astronomy of Harvard University and the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Astronomy. She does research in astrophysics, astrochemistry, especially the impact of chemistry on planet formation, including the compositions of nascent planets. Among other awards, she is recipient of the AAS Newton Lacey Pierce Prize, the Packard Fellowship, and the Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship. Dr. Oberg is director and co-founder of the Society of Catholic Scientists, and she serves as the Harvard Catholic Center's undergraduate faculty advisor. Professor Oberg.
Thank you, Kate, both for that introduction and for being such an important part of this lecture series, which is on a topic that's very close to my own heart, this discourse between science and religion. If we look historically, the past couple of centuries have nurtured a myth of a sort of fundamentally adversarial relationship between science and religion, especially organized religion. But this is a myth. Which generally has treated anecdotes as evidence, which is of course not the very scientific thing to do. And has, I would say, mostly willfully or otherwise ignored an otherwise rather obvious pattern of a fruitful coexistence and cooperation between science and theology, which was really the norm up until the past century or so. Some evidence for this latter reading of history would be the deep religiosity of many of the most famous scientists, including people like Newton, Kepler, Father Lemaitre, the ones that really shaped, now I sort of purposely picked people from my own field, but these are the scientists that have shaped the fields of physics and astrophysics. It's also the origin of the university, including the roots of places like Harvard in the Catholic Middle Ages. It's the use of scientific and natural philosophical discoveries to better interpret scripture, which has been a very important part of scriptural readings of creation. This is something that you find in people like St. Augustine, so really going back through sort of beginnings of the Catholic theological tradition. And it's also, if you look at the claimed motivations of many scientists, or their religious motivations to uncover the order of the universe. And yet, today, there is this proposed incompatibility between science and religion, which is frequently cited as one of the most common objections to religious practice or to the intellectual influence of religion. So it is in light of all this that I am really excited to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Father John Kartje. So Father Kartje is the rector and president of the University of St. Mary of the Lake and Mundelein Seminary. And as a sidebar, I had the opportunity and the pleasure to visit Mundelein for the first time this summer at the yearly meeting of the Society of Catholic Scientists, and I can attest to how beautiful of a place it is, and really a place where I felt sort of deep spiritual peace. So congratulations, Father Kartje, on this beautiful seminary. So this is the principal seminary and school of theology for the formation of priests in the Archdiocese of Chicago. But its reach is far beyond Chicago, with seminarians from over 40 dioceses worldwide. Father Kartje, in his very person, I would say, is a sign of the harmony between science and faith. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and a Bachelor of Science in Physics in 1987 from the University of Chicago. And he went then on to study astronomy and astrophysics at, again, the University of Chicago. And in 1995, he earned his PhD with a thesis focused on the so-called active galactic nuclei. So these are these giant black hole engines of galaxies. 15 years later, he received a second doctorate, this time in sacred theology from the Catholic University of America's Department of Biblical Studies. He is hence, as a uniquely qualified to lead this discussion of the proper practices and interactions of science and theology. In between these two doctorates, in 2002, Father Kartje was ordained a priest in the Archdiocese of Chicago. He has served as a faculty member at both the seminary and the Institute for Priestly Formation since 2009. He previously served as the director and chaplain of the Shale Catholic Center at Northwestern University, at the St. Thomas the Apostle Parish in Washington, and as associate pastor at St. Benedict Parish in Chicago. Father Kartje has written on topics ranging from these models of this active galactic nuclei that I was talking about, to wisdom epistemology in the Psalter, to priestly formation. He has become a leading figure in science and theology discussions, and if you're interested in hearing more after today's lecture, you can hear his rector reflections on the podcast Formation. But now I give you Father John Kartje.
Thanks so much, Dr. Oberg. And yeah, it was a real honor for us at Mundelein to host the Society of Catholic Scientists, which is open to undergraduates, so please consider that. It's a wonderful thing that Dr. Steve Barr and associates got going. Well, there's a whole cottage industry that's been growing up on the dialogue between faith and science, I'm happy to say. But as Dr. Oberg pointed out, there's still an awful lot of misperception, belief that maybe there is some sort of underlying conflict between the two, and it is indeed one of the top three, if not the top reason given why many people either stay away from the Catholic faith or walk away from the Catholic faith. So there's a lot of good teaching and dialogue. If you dive into it, I'm sure that'll be part of this series, busting that myth. What I like to do when I engage this topic, though, is rather than trying to right the wrongs, and that needs to be done, that's hugely important, but to also elevate the fact that, if you have crossed the hurdle and, you're okay with the existence of God, the way scientists practice their craft, or the epistemology of science, I think has an awful lot to contribute to people of faith. Because I also think people walk away from the church or Christianity today, not just because they see some sort of conflict, but there's largely a sense of apathy, or a sense of, okay, maybe I know the truths of the faith, but how do I access them? You can tell me that God is a trinity of persons, that's wonderful, but what is that doing for me? You know, how is that somehow enriching my life? And the whole reason that we worked so hard over the centuries to understand that deep theology is that it did grow out of the fact that an interaction with God is a deeply enriching experience. But even when I say that, an interaction with God, well, I should be saying a Trinity, right? As Christians, there's not just a generic God. The Trinity matters. So it's that kind of thinking that if you said to a scientist, oh, by the way, what you've been calling God is actually Father, Son, and Spirit, well, they'd want to dive into that. You know, what does that mean? Why is that important? Why do you say it? Not to be adversarial, but simply as a way of saying that's really important. That's not just some generic divinity. So it's thinking the way maybe a scientist thinks that I think can be very helpful sometimes for the way we as believers think about our faith, especially if we've grown up with it all our lives. And so the title that was used for this talk is makes much more sense than the one that I gave Dr. Kate, but I'm going to reference it as it's up there. Through a glass darkly, which you might recognize as the King James translation of what comes at the end of St. Paul's famous hymn, almost to love. Love is patient, love is kind. And he says, you know, when I was a child, I lived like a child, but now I'm a grown man, so I've put away my childish things. And when ultimately my life in love, right, when we are completed, he says, then we will know the fullness of the love of God. But now it's like we view through a glass darkly. There's something a little bit imprecise, which we would expect living here on earth. But I like to think of that maybe as a little bit of a paradigm for the scientific endeavor. We're always, if you like, viewing the splendor and the fullness of creation through a glass darkly. And what we contribute in our time, what we receive from the contributions of others, is just always peering maybe a little bit more clearly through that vision or through that veil. Yeah, so there it is, 1 Corinthians 13:12. And again, remember, that's the end of the love is patient, love is kind. Very familiar wedding reading. I wish they pushed it on to this glass darkly thing, but maybe you don't want to throw that into a wedding mass. When I was, way back, just starting my graduate studies, John Paul II was really, coming into his full force, and certainly he was a pope engaging or willing to engage questions of faith and science, much more so than some of his immediate predecessors, though certainly over the 2,000 years of Christianity, there have been any number of popes who were by no means afraid to engage this dialogue. But the Vatican runs an observatory in Rome originally, and now out in Arizona is where a lot of the research is done. But he wrote a letter to the director of the Vatican Observatory, recently passed away, Father George Coyne. Jesuits run the observatory. And this is what it said, and I promise this will be the only slide with a lot of text. Texty PowerPoints drive me crazy, but this is worth quoting at some length. So it's well into his pontificate. And so he's saying religion and science must preserve their own autonomy and their distinctiveness. Okay, so far so good. They each operate in different spheres, and they must preserve their own autonomy. Religion is not founded on science, nor is science an extension of religion. Fair enough. One is not necessarily founded upon the other. Each should possess its own principles, its pattern of procedures, its diversities of interpretation, and its own conclusions. Its own principles, its own patterns of procedure, methodologies, its own diversity of interpretation, hermeneutics, its own conclusions, while each can and should support the other as distinct dimensions of a common human culture, Neither ought to assume that it forms a necessary premise for the other. And I remember reading this, I'm a gung-ho first-year graduate student. I was glad that our Pope was engaging this topic in general, but I remember feeling a little bit deflated. And all that I mean by that is, there's nothing here that I would say is wrong, but it's kind of a two ships passing in the night politely, if you like. I respect your sphere, you respect my sphere, we can certainly dialogue with each other. But I remember having this sense that if you're a theologian, what part of the universe aren't you interested in? Right? I mean, no theologian should say, well, I do the God stuff, you can do the science stuff. Obviously, we don't want them killing each other. We can move past that era, hopefully, though some people see that conflict as almost violent. And if you're a scientist, what part of the universe aren't you interested in? We're very specialized today. I understand that. Theologians are every bit as specialized as scientists are. But even if a scientist doesn't believe in God, she should be fascinated by the fact that billions of people do. Even if a scientist doesn't see any value in organized religion, if they care about the universe, as every good scientist I've known ultimately does, in a general way, then the fact that this organized religion in such a rich variety is there, that isn't something they should just say, well, I don't, that's not worth my time. Yes, they're specialized, what have you. So theology, right, the logos of theos, of God, that encompasses everything, and science is a part of everything. As you all know, scientia, knowledge, right, as Dr. Karen was saying, this idea of a scientist as someone who puts on a lab coat and goes into the lab, that very word only dates back to the 19th century, scientist. Before that, you just think. And what I say to my students at the seminary is, you either have a brain or you don't. And if you do, then theology and science and any other logi is fair game. So I would just say we can and should say more than this. Not that St. John Paul II needs my help, but I was a brash, first-year graduate student. I want to show a little clip put out by the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. And if you go on their website, there's a lot of good material. If maybe you're talking to high school students, something like that, but this is not just geared towards students. And if there's one connecting point that I'd like to suggest, and listen for this through all your speakers as you just kind of live out your own passion, if there's a connecting point between faith and science, I would say it certainly lives within the realm of awe and wonder, if it lives anywhere. If you do scholarship that you don't find awesome, if you're asked to do scholarship that you don't find wonderful, maybe you have the intellectual capacity to churn out a few books or papers, but they're going to be weak. And I would say that whether you're a scientist or a theologian or any other member of the academy. And what draws us, I think what draws any scientist into her or his work is not all that different from what draws any theologian or believer into their work. So we're going to go high tech here, because this is my only clip with sound. So. I think it's on this side.
The instant that one realizes that they're having a genuinely new thought is essentially indescribable. I'm sure that this is something similar to what people describe as abuse. It seems unworldly.
I had a little telescope I'd take up country, and everybody in the village would come out and they'd look through the telescope and see the craters of the moon and the rings of Saturn. They go on, just like my family friends back in Michigan do. And it finally hit me. This is what makes us human. This ability to look at the sky with wonder.
When I look through a microscope, I can't help but be struck with a sense of awe and wonder about what I'm looking at. And I can't help but reflect on the larger questions of life.
The human spirit does gain a lift from pure curiosity, trying to understand who we are and where we fit into the larger scheme of things.
Because if we didn't have that sense of awe, if we didn't have that sense of curiosity, we wouldn't start down this road in the first place. It's hard to do world-class science.
When you look into something, you almost always get a surprise, and then that surprise leads you into new pathways.
Are there failures? Absolutely. When you don't have very firm grounds, you're really searching for a needle in a haystack. I collected a lot of hay before I found that needle.
It sure is fun to play in this space and make new discoveries and hopefully make contributions that move us forward.
Science loves problems. Any fool can find the solution. It takes a genius to find the question.
We live in a world loaded with questions and puzzles. If you know how to look, you can begin to see connections among humans and other species, and between humans, other species, and the planet itself. And when you see those connections, it's hard not to be in awe.
That kinship that human beings share with all other creatures on Earth is a very, very powerful thing and helps us to understand the continuities and to place into context our uniqueness.
So we get into those philosophical questions of what is life, and within that context, what is it to be human?
There's this incredible universe that surrounds the Earth for us to go and explore, and that we as humans have to pick up that charge.
And then it becomes the task of human societies, cultures, and religious communities and philosophers to dig deep and find out what that message is that's beyond just what science is telling us.
Okay. So just to get a little sense there from, obviously that's not engaging the Catholic intellectual tradition per se, but the strong motivating force that I think drives pretty much anyone who's interested in whatever their vocation is, but certainly for scientists, that ability to just look with awe and wonder at something new. And I know for myself, what motivated me when I was doing science is very much what motivates me in doing theology and parish ministry. It's just that sense of every time you wake up, you're walking into a new encounter. Whether it's some data that no one has ever looked at before, whether it's somebody who's dealing with difficulty in their marriage or with an illness, or deep sense of gratitude that's come to them in spiritual direction, you are always in the presence of mystery to some degree. And if we lose sight of that, been there, done that, well, shame on us. And to recapture that sense of awe and wonder is always a key point. And usually it can be attained if we just allow ourselves to step back from our cynicism a bit. So obviously in the news these days, and rightly so, NASA's latest large telescope, James Webb Telescope, an artist's rendition, right? No cameraman was out there taking that. And again, just very broadly speaking, this isn't a science talk, and there are far more qualified people here to do that. But what I want us to get at again is, why is there a Webb telescope in the first place? Why did anyone even think to bother to build one, launch it, and say, this is something I want to explore? So, the idea of an electromagnetic spectrum, right, we're all familiar with from, grade school, but originally, you just had light, right? That's what your eyes could see. Why would we ever think that there are other wavelengths in the spectrum, let alone that they just extend infinitely in either direction? Because, and here you can just trace out some of the historical telescopes that NASA's put up. Hubble there in the UV somewhat and the visible, Webb now in the infrared, Spitzer further in the infrared. There are X-ray telescopes, there are radio telescopes, but why would anyone ever think there's something beyond just the light that we can see? And that's what I want to talk about here, as a sense of what is motivating that imagination, and is there something in that that we as people of faith perhaps might borrow from? Because for many of us, the excitement of realizing there might be wavelengths other than visible light Maybe we don't have that sense of awe and wonder if someone tells you, oh, by the way, God is a trinity of 3 divine persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. As soon as you teach your 2-year-old to make the sign of the cross, you pretty much taught him everything, right? And that's a beautiful thing, but there can also be a price to that. And so to think about what is it that's motivated someone to ever think, there might be anything other than visible light, which ultimately leads to the motivation of designing, launching, using something like the Webb Telescope. But just to see the beauty of this, if you go on the Webb page, haha, little astronomy joke there for you. If you go on the Webb page, there's a lot of great little clips and images, obviously. NASA knows how to market themselves. But what you're going to see here from the Crab Nebula, the remnant of a stellar explosion, if you just go through the wavelengths, there you are in infrared. Here's an optical image from Hubble. Has there been a published Crab image from Webb? Anybody? I haven't. I'm sure it's in the works. X-ray. So you're looking at all different wavelengths of the same object, right? You're not looking at different objects when you see those different shapes. What you're seeing is the material that's, radiating different wavelengths of light. And when you put it all together, that's what you see. But once again, the very first time someone with an optical telescope looked at the Crab Nebula, that's not what they saw, right? What they saw was what you could see with visible light. And whatever led someone to think, let's look at other wavelengths, right? That's the journey. Jesus was a man. He was a man from Galilee. He was a man from Nazareth, right? Whatever led people to think, this is the second person of the Trinity, right? This is the incarnate Son of God. We know the answer. Pick up any gospel, right? It's right there. Spoiler alert if you haven't read one yet, but it's okay. Imagine you're just encountering him, right? Imagine everything that goes into the intellectual, the emotional, the spiritual exploration to come to a conclusion of what we say in our rich Christology, our Trinitarian theology. There was a time when that was as new as thinking about other wavelengths emanating from celestial objects. So how did we get here? Because if you can relive that journey a little bit, when we pray to our God as Christians, you can think about, how do I access the beauty and the power of the Trinity? Why is that special for me? Why does that enrich my intimate knowledge of our God? And here's just another example. In the Carina galaxy, again, comparing visible wavelength with Webb infrared wavelength. You're looking at the same object, but you're able to go through a glass darkly piece. You're seeing a little bit more deeply into what's there. So again, why would anyone ever think to do such a thing? So, just a quick history through why we ever thought about there being other wavelengths. And it starts with observing a phenomenon that you simply can't ignore. And it's basically electricity and magnetism. Something as powerful as a bolt of lightning, something as basic as a magnetic lodestone. People have known about those things for millennia. Certainly lightning has been around as long as there's been anything to be around, and for people to notice and question. So fast forward a long, long time as people are beginning to explore and play with these things, you get into the era of some names that might be familiar: Ampere, Ørsted, Faraday. And what they're starting to do is harness the fact that I observe these phenomena that just seem to naturally be there, right? There's certain stones that seem to have magnetic properties. Lightning strikes, and there's a power there that I notice. Some connection there between the light and the power and the energy. You can rub a rod and make your hair stand up, all those kinds of things you do this. So people are noticing this. Call that revelation, if you like. Nobody derived lightning. It's just there. You notice it. You encounter it. And then go back to awe and wonder. There's something inside of us that begins to say, what's going on here? There's obviously a power. There's a curiosity. And eventually it reaches the point where we use our intellects to begin to say, how can I probe this? How can I maybe reproduce some of it? How can I explore what's there? Aristotle, beginning of metaphysics, all human beings desire to know, right? We're wired that way. So really fast forwarding, Faraday, we're into the 19th century, Michael Faraday and this guy here, James Clerk Maxwell, Scottish. Faraday was about 40 years older than Maxwell, but they were very much interested in electricity. And it was Faraday who had noticed things like if I push a magnet through a coil, a metal coil, it seems to generate a current in the coil. Or if I run a current through a wire, that can almost behave like a magnet in other ways. So we say electricity and magnetism. Originally, those were two very distinct things. So you have Faraday, the guy who loved to putz around. There's some wonderful pictures of his laboratory. Maybe it looked like your grandpa's old garage or something. Just all kinds of clutter laying around. He was a tinkerer. Maxwell, more the intellectual, in the traditional sense of the word, a brilliant mathematician. But they both contributed something to trying to understand where their awe and wonder was leading them. And so, in particular, you might be familiar with Maxwell's equations. Maxwell never wrote them like this, incidentally. He wrote a much more complicated, somewhat messy version. This fellow, Heaviside, who's there on the right, actually gave us the formula that we know. But I'm putting that up there because when Maxwell died, his was not the prevailing understanding of electricity and magnetism. There were other theories, and certainly his equations were not being widely used in his own lifetime. It was Heaviside and some others in England who really championed that understanding. Because what these equations essentially tell you is that there should be wavelengths other than simply the visible wavelengths that we see. There ought to be wavelengths that are shorter than what we see. There ought to be wavelengths that are longer. There's no limit to the wavelength that you should have from this kind of radiation. So this is a claim that's put out there that nobody has any strong reason to believe is actually describing the world we see. Think about some of the earliest people who maybe talked about who Jesus was. They saw the miracles, perhaps. They heard him preach. Well, when did it get to the point of people really saying, okay, this is the incarnate Son of God? How do you get population, a group, to understand that? It isn't just head knowledge, though that's important. You engage through prayer, you engage through community, as St. Paul would tell us, is the body of Christ. Something like that happens in the scientific enterprise, where eventually an understanding begins to take root. So the guy on the left here is Heinrich Hertz, right? Obviously getting into radio waves. So a key point was that there was Otto von Helmholtz, another German. He understood the impact of Maxwell's equations, and he pushed younger scientists in Germany in particular to look for radiation that had these different wavelengths. So his name is not often, Helmholtz is certainly a revered name, but this was someone who was driving the enterprise through inspiration, saying to younger scientists, hey, Maxwell's onto something here. Can you observe this radiation? Can you look at longer wavelengths? Can you find something at shorter wavelengths? And Hertz was one of the protégés. And so we ultimately credit with the discovery of radio waves. But the way that happened was he was trying to find something, right? Sometimes the story is told, well, he was just kind of putzing around and, he stumbled over radio waves. No, he was looking for something. He was looking for radiation with longer wavelengths because Helmholtz, his mentor, had said, why don't you try that? But he wasn't having a lot of success. He was using sort of conventional ways of doing the exploration. And then what ultimately happened was he generated, unknowing to him, some radio waves. He knew he was producing radiation, and he effectively had a crude antenna on the other side of his lab that was picking up the signal. So we're not going to go into all that, and I couldn't do it justice anyways if I tried. The point is, he's trying to do something to gain a greater understanding. And in that process, what then emanates, because he's dealing with what is reality. He just doesn't fully know how to describe it or talk about it. And then suddenly what's manifested, and he's able to recognize it. There's something here. Once that happens, once the antenna, right, which he doesn't know is behaving like an antenna, picks up the signal, now he can begin to explore. Right? Think about the religious, the theological endeavor. Right? We don't derive God, obviously. We don't create God. People can make up gods. There's plenty of mythologies where people have thought of maybe God is this, maybe God is that. But if it's the true God, we do our best through our own human imperfections. We love imperfectly. We desire knowledge imperfectly. And so we shouldn't be surprised that, those are ways, those are thresholds, if you like, into engaging and encountering the true fullness of God. We're only going to get there, piecemeal, through a glass darkly. But it's that sort of endeavor. Well, that's at the longer wavelengths, the radio wavelengths. How about the shorter wavelengths? Well, Helmholtz was quite an inspirer because he put someone else on to look for shorter wavelength radiation, higher energy radiation. And who is that? There's Hertz's lab, by the way, later on in his life. But notice the date, 1880s. Maxwell, I believe, died right around the time of the American Civil War, so 1860-ish. So pretty quickly on, you have the discovery of radio waves. Well, what about the shorter wavelengths? Helmholtz said to another one of his protégés, Wilhelm Röntgen, hey, why don't you look for shorter wavelength? Because if Maxwell is correct, you should be able to find radiation at all wavelengths. So Röntgen, one of these amazing people, maybe a little bit like Faraday, indefatigable, right? He's designing equipment, he's really working at things. And in particular, what he was working with were cathode ray tubes. So if your hair looks like mine, or more so, you might remember, TVs with old tubes in them. We used to break them up. I never knew how to actually fix them. But in any event, fluorescent screens. He's shooting high-energy electrons at a fluorescent screen. And he has reasons for wanting to do that. But at one point, he's doing this experiment, and the belief would be that you shoot the electrons from one end of the tube to the other end, and that's where the radiation would be. It'd be there inside the tube. And so one of these experimental runs, he wanted to make sure he blocked out any extraneous light. He covers it over with heavy paper. He shoots the electrons. They hit the screen. And he has a fluorescent screen on the other side of the room that shouldn't be affected or impacted at all. And lo and behold, that screen starts to fluoresce, right? Starts to light up. He's not shooting electrons at it. It's on the other side of the room. He's thinking everything should be well contained within his cathode ray tube. And all of a sudden, not all that different from what Hertz found with his radio waves that seemed to be somehow signaling an antenna where that shouldn't have happened. Well, what's actually going on is the electrons are hitting the other end of the tube, Bremsstrahlung, right, breaking radiation. When I landed at Logan today, I think my pilot must have been a former Blue Angel or something, because we break really strong, if you've ever had that experience. You're jarring there against your seatbelt. When you come to a rapid deceleration, you generate energy, generate heat. Well, high energy electron hits the screen, comes to a rapid stop, generates energy. And in this case, they're X-rays. The X-rays go through the dark paper, they go through the glass tube, they go through a whole lot of other things, and some of them are hitting his fluorescent screen on the other side of the room. And so where he would least expect it, he's noticing these flashes of light. And so, again, this is exactly what you do when you encounter something with awe and wonder. Try and understand, what is it? He actually looked down the tube at one point. This is an era where we're not quite sure the damage that this stuff could do. Marie Curie, right, poisoned herself from her work with radium, not fully understood what the impact of these things could be. But he's absolutely fascinated, and according to his own account, for 3 days, he secluded himself in his lab, didn't leave at all. He's running all these experiments on what is this stuff that's somehow getting out of the glass tube and illuminating, the screen far away. And he notices that these things are pretty penetrating. They go through paper, they go through cardboard, they go through books, and he's really excited about this fact. Now, from all intents and purposes, he had a wonderful marriage, and he wanted to share this with his wife. So he was saying, you know, this goes through books, it goes through wood, seems to go through everything. It wouldn't go through lead. Certain very dense things these rays would not get through, but he really wanted to share this with his wife. So, not surprisingly, he wanted to know, would they go through her? And this is probably the most famous X-ray image in all of history, right? That's his wife's hand. It's not arthritis, that's her wedding ring there. And this was quite a novelty in the late 19th century because the production of these, X-rays, and so people would almost treat it like a game. Oh, take an X-ray of your hand or of your skull. And you can find those kinds of images. My point is, think about the journey here. You're starting off with something very natural, lightning, lodestones, magnetic stones that seem to point north, leading to, after a long time, people being curious, wonder, poking, prodding, beginning to harness, if you like, this understanding of A, electricity, and B, magnetism. Then through the work of, some really focused mathematical genius in Maxwell and some others, coming up with this way, this mathematical way of talking about the world. Theologians have a particular language for talking about God. We don't fully capture the full essence of God, obviously, but you need to have a precise way of describing what you're encountering. That's very helpful. And for science, that's often mathematics. So you have this beautiful mathematical description, which, if it's true, then says, there's a lot out there that you haven't noticed yet. There's a lot out there that you haven't seen or perceived, so why don't you go try and engage it? Lots and lots of people tried to sort out what did the incarnation mean before we had the Nicene Creed, right? And we should all verse ourselves in the history of Christianity. I wish I did more than I do. But every time you go back and you read those accounts from the early Christian councils, I find it enriches greatly my own ability for prayer and worship and just the ability to appreciate God. So there's Rector. Well, people who study cognition, right, how we learn, they have something they refer to as epistemic emotions. So think of epistemology, right, the study of how we learn, how we know something. Well, what we know from psychological studies and others is that there are certain emotions, certain emotional reactions that actually prime the brain to learn better, okay? I wish I'd known this when I was in high school. So certain emotions can actually help you be more perceptive, more retentive of information. And awe and wonder are two of those, right? I love this image. Little girl and this enormous manatee, right? You can just see the awe and wonder without even looking at her face. But those emotions are what psychologists refer to as epistemic emotions. So it shouldn't surprise us that some of the greatest scientists and some of the greatest theologians were those who were most awestruck by the wonder of the natural world or God. So what's the impact of these epistemic emotions? Well, for one thing, they are very conducive to learning science. And studies of practicing scientists have been done to derive some of these conclusions. So for one thing that comes with this is there's the violation of expectations, as we call it. In other words, I expected to see this, but I'm willing to accept that that's not what I'm getting, right? Hertz, Röntgen, they were not expecting to see what they found. And they're willing, under the spell of awe and wonder, if I can put it that way, they're willing to accept the violation of those expectations. Think of what people expected Jesus to be, who they expected him to be, how they expected the God of Israel, Yahweh, to behave. What does it take for them to be able to relax those expectations and even accept their violation? An uncertainty-driven exploration. So I want to explore, even though I'm not certain, right? Some people are paralyzed by that. If I don't have certitude, I don't want to take the next step. Think of chapter 6 of the Gospel of John. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. And John tells us that day many walked away. It was too difficult for them. It's not easy to want to move forward in the face of uncertainty. But I would argue every good scientist I've ever known is drawn by that. That's what excites them. Yes, it can be frustrating at times. Every good theologian or parish priest I've ever known is drawn by that. Uncertainty driven, right? You see that in the Gospels everywhere, you know. Drop your net, come and follow me. If that's not an uncertain invitation, I don't know what is. And for every Peter who dropped their nets, you know, maybe there was a Joe or Fred who said, no, I just can't do it. I'll wait and see what Peter does. Cognitive accommodation, right? That willingness to literally allow there to be allowances, changes in our very cognitive behavior. And then finally, conceptual change. That ability to get around to accept that there is a change in our very conceptualization of the world. The point is, what we know are that certain emotions like awe and wonder literally help prime the brain, you know, to make these kinds of allowances. And I would argue, take any successful scientist, and you're going to find these being qualities, not everyone every time, but more often than not. And I would say the same thing about any good theologian. And I'm going to stick to the 30 minutes here. So what I wanted to end with, something like this, think about the road to Emmaus, right? Very familiar scene, maybe not to everybody here. You know, Jesus has died, right? He's been buried. Yes, he's risen, but these followers of Jesus don't know it yet. And so Luke gives us this powerful account of their walking away from Jerusalem, and they're devastated, right? They're devastated. Jesus has been crucified, he's died, he's buried. End of story, as far as they're concerned. How is their mind and heart prepared, you know? Well, it's anything but open. It's downtrodden. It's sad. Even though it's a familiar passage, let's look at it through the lens of this idea of what is it that gets the scientists to say, I think there's something here, or I don't think there's something here and I don't want to go there. Because for every, you know, Hertz and Röntgen and Maxwell, there are 1,000, not only who maybe don't have the same intellectual capacity, but just don't have the same curiosity or the same comfort with uncertitude, if that's a word. So, very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem, talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they're talking and discussing, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. So what is the state of their mind and heart? They're sad, they're distraught, maybe they're even fearful. Jesus comes in their midst, right? We're not told he was disguised. He's in their midst. But they are so prepared to not see that. They are so prepared to not hear the possibility that maybe he's risen from the dead. Think about where everybody's mind was when someone first came along and said, hey, why don't you look for radiation at different wavelengths than what you see? Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. He said to them, what is this conversation which you are holding with each other as you walk? They stood still looking and said, one of them, Cleopas, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? So there's even a little bit of an attitude there. The lived experience is working against their openness to possibility. Their lived experience is working against their openness to possibility. Think about what that looks like maybe for you or me as we maybe struggle at times in the spiritual life. You can read a great book of theology, and I would encourage all of us to do that, but it's not necessarily going to be good news for us unless we have an openness to the possibility. What shuts it down? Well, things like grief, things like embarrassment or shame, right? So we should never think the intellect and the emotions are somehow disconnected. What things, Jesus said? And they said to him concerning Jesus of Nazareth, prophet, mighty in deed and word, how our chief priests, rulers, delivered him up. But listen to this, but we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. expectations. Every scientist goes to any experiment or works on any equation with expectations. There are hopes, right? There are aspirations. Even if in all humility says, I'm not quite sure how this is going to turn out, but there are expectations. Every theologian has expectations or hopes of what thinking about, praying about God is going to bring. Do we have the ability to relax those expectations? The experience of awe and wonder at times does do just that. Yes, but we had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since this has happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back saying that he had even seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. So they've heard the message. They've heard the Easter message, and it is not penetrating. It is so against their expectations. They've not yet had awe or wonder in the context of a risen Christ. What they're getting is a rather extraordinary report from some women, and they're able to discount it fairly easily. And then, as we know, Jesus stays with them, and he says, as they're sharing a meal, O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And then they gather together. Jesus acts like he's going to go on. They say, no, stay, let's have a meal together. And then he says to them, he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. They said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? And they rose that hour and returned to Jerusalem. Were not our hearts on fire as he explained to us how all the scriptures described him? Well, their hearts may have been on fire, but they still didn't see. When did they ultimately see and connect everything? In the breaking of the bread, right? In that evocation of the last meal. And so I'd just like to close then with the two great traditions that faith and science bring together. And, what Kate had asked me to do was try to lay a little bit of a groundwork, because you're going to have amazing speakers coming throughout this series. But as they talk, or as you do your own reading and your own thinking and praying, there's the scientific tradition and there's the sacramental tradition. And I would argue that in the history of Christianity, and certainly in the history of Catholic Christianity, those two things come together very beautifully. Because both of them, I would argue, are grounded in our human capacity for engaging with the world around us. And that world is imbued. It's imbued with the divine, right? Our theology tells us the cosmos that we see is the product of an intelligent creator God. Well, even if someone doesn't believe that, as they, as a scientist, go to look at the world around them, are they willing to engage the unknown? Are they willing to be inspired? And it's been my experience that any good scientist is more than motivated to do so, because that's where their curiosity is. And oftentimes that curiosity has been sparked by awe or wonder. And that can be simply looking at a beautiful night sky. That can also be in a dark way, dealing with deep grief, loss, death, betrayal, all those things that move the mind and heart. And all that sacramentality is essentially saying is, broader than the 7 sacraments, is that this world is indeed instilled with that divine presence and spark. But you have to be willing to engage it. And so awe and wonder, whether it's 19th century scientists, whether it's the pilgrims on the road to Emmaus, it really is what drives both the sacramental curiosity and the scientific curiosity. And any good work of theology or any good work of science can be a jumping off point for going from one to the other. So I realize we're not addressing here, I didn't address here, trying to disprove an atheist who doesn't believe science has anything to do with religion. But I would argue at a more foundational level, the way a scientist thinks can actually be very productive in helping someone encounter the divine, whether they're coming at it as a curious atheist or whether they're coming at it as a very deeply faithful believer. So, Kate or Dr. Karen, how are we going to do this moving forward?
Well, first we should
Thank you.